Well, g'day. I'm Roland Hearn, and this is A Walk in the Garden. I'm really excited and happy and delighted to have my good friend Tom Oord with me today. Not walking in the garden, as you can see, but I am in my office speaking with Tom across, I guess it's about 8,000 miles. So g'day, Tom. How you doing?
Doing well, Roland. Thanks so much for the chance to have this conversation.
Well, I can't tell you how excited I am for this opportunity. We met virtually about 20 odd years ago. I was planting a church in Texas with a very good friend of mine, Brad Mercer, who passed away 13 years ago. That's hard to believe.
Wow.
Um, and we were trying to build a church consistently around the theme of love, and that if it doesn't have anything to do with love, we're not going to do it. And I felt somewhat alone in that process. I mean, there were a lot of good books that were helpful in that process that centered on love. Dunning and Great House and Wine Coop and, of course, John Wesley were all pieces of that puzzle. But there wasn't any active engagement that I saw at that time that related to what it means to actually live in the space of love and the consequences of that for the church. And then we were chatting together on NASNet, and your name started popping up, and it hadn't been long after I think you completed your PhD, and you were saying pretty much the same things, and I felt very excited at that point in time to have somebody that knew what they were talking about to be able to say that. So this is a thrill. So Tom, let me introduce you to my audience. You graduated from, I've got notes here, mate, so I'm sorry you're reading,
No problem.
from the Northwest Nazarene College in 1988. You passed it for 4 years. Then you went and got your Master of Divinity from Nazarene Theological Seminary, and then went to Claremont Graduate University and earned a Master's of Arts and a PhD at that university. And now you are director of the doctoral program in Open and Relational Theology at Northwind Theological Seminary. You've written and/or edited more than 25 books and a host of academic articles that all center around the themes, or most of them center around the themes that we'll be discussing today. So, Tom, your life journey in that process keeps you bringing you back to the same space. Would that be a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think the way I would put it is I have many, many interests, and they go this way and that: science, philosophy, social issues, culture, but the core are the issues of love. In fact,
Right.
as you said, talked about how many books I had written or edited, I smiled because just recently my wife saw another book that I had put out, and somewhere in I guess the subtitle, the word love was, and she said, "Every book has got to be about love." I said, "Well, not really, but I just can't get away from the centrality, at least for me, the centrality of the issues of love for all dimensions of reality."
Right. That's fantastic. That really is. Well, thanks for coming and being a part of this space. Um, I started this little experiment, for want of a better term, or presentation, a walk in the garden, as a result of trying to deal with my own frustrations. When you make love the center of your worldview and hopefully of your ministry, that very much involves presence. And during the COVID crisis, my capacity to actually physically be with people was significantly reduced, and that led to an internalized frustration. That ultimately the idea came to me when I was walking in the garden around my home or mowing the lawn, that I could create videos about my own personal journey and about my perspectives on love and grace, and that would create a form of presence. The idea then became to call it a walk in the garden. Because I'm walking in the garden. But there was reflections of that, of the great foundational mythological story of the church. And I explain what a myth is in the very first video. It's not about something not being true. It's something that the facts are not relevant in. It's about the essence of what it's trying to say in terms of identity. And so the garden story is absolutely an identity story for the Jewish faith and for Christians. And so my walk in the garden becomes actually a desire to walk from that space back to the original relational space of Adam and Eve. And so my hope is that there'll be people that watch these videos that don't have any faith at all, and it might be a helpful introduction to the journey of faith without all the baggage that often comes with that. Also Christians that are looking to try and wrestle with issues in their own lives that they're struggling with, that their faith to that point hasn't addressed. And ultimately, for the people that whom I'm responsible for, that might create a common language to talk about the issues of faith. So that's where we're at this morning. Does that sound fair to you, Tom?
It sounds great.
All right. So let's get into it, shall we? Then enough waffle, as we'd say here in Australia. So, Tom, in my last video, I introduced your book, God Can't, because I was trying to very briefly respond to the idea of who God is. Your book, God Can't, is an extension of the book that you wrote on the uncontrolling God, which both represent the idea of essential kenosis. So I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit for us today.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks have an intuition or some kind of sense that there's something bigger than them. Philosophers, we call it transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
Many people call this God. I think latest polls say more than 90% of people have this sense of there's something bigger, more, and yet it's not exactly clear about what that thing is, what this God is, if you believe in God. And I happen to believe in God. And one of the biggest struggles, biggest questions people have is, if there is such a thing called God, and if this God is, as many Christians and Jews and even Muslims say, loving and powerful, then why do we see so much evil in the world? Pointless pain, unnecessary suffering. And for many people, it's personal. They've gone through struggles. They've been abused. They've been mistreated. And so they wonder, well, look, if this God is loving, loves me, cares for me, and is powerful, did this God cause these things to happen to me?
Right.
Or allow them to happen to me? That's more common. God didn't do it to me, but God allowed it. And my view is that a God who either causes or even allows genuine evil is not perfectly loving.
Right.
And so the provocative title of this book, God Can't, is the claim that God can't single-handedly prevent the evils that have happened to you and me and the larger evils in human history.
That word single-handedly is interesting, isn't it? Because you have a specific thought about that, don't you?
Yes. I mean, sometimes people hear me say God can't prevent evil, and they have the idea that, God is on the sidelines, kind of eating popcorn, twiddling his thumbs, looking at what's going on, the coronavirus, injustice, whatever, and just kind of saying, hey, good luck down there. I'm up here doing my thing. In other words, they have a disengaged God of deism.
Right.
But the God I'm proposing, who actually exists, is a God not only of love that's uncontrolling, but is present and active throughout all creation. So back to what you said earlier about presence, that's really powerful and important for my view.
Yeah.
So I like to say this: the God of love, who is present to everyone and everything, can't control anyone or anything. And that's the key idea that I think a lot of folks have grabbed onto this. And now that makes a little more sense given the experience of suffering that I've had.
Right. One of the things that caught my attention years ago was your definition of love, which entails, and I think you might have expanded from here, but entails acting intentionally in sympathetic response to others to promote overall well-being. For me, in my journey, I had very much come to the place where I understood that when you experience love, you experience worth. When you love somebody, you are communicating worth, which is the overall well-being part of that statement. And the implication for that then was that if I was experiencing worthlessness, I wasn't simultaneously effectively experiencing love. And from a Christian perspective, that meant that there was a problem in the way that I was relating to God, which had to be my problem. It was at that point that the controlling part came in, because I'm by nature, I'm not sure that's the right word to use, but I use it anyway, a controlling person, right? I want things to be a certain way, and I work hard at trying to make it that way. And when people don't respond effectively, I raise levels of pressure to get them to respond to the way that I want them to respond. And so when I started recognizing, and I guess I'd have to say I recognized that in my marriage first and foremost, if I wanted to communicate love to my wife, I had to let go. I had to stop controlling. I had to let her become who she really was. And that included things like creating separate check accounts at one period of time, just so that she would recognize, because in a lot of dysfunctional homes and families, marriages, controlling the finances is a form of domination, right? So we went through that process. At that point, I recognized this idea of the will of God, which from our theological perspective, traditionally, we would have said God has this overall picture that isn't necessarily specific, but that he has moments in that desire that he wants us to lead us to, and then we have to choose those things. And as we don't choose them, he ramps up the pressure to get us to choose the right thing, right? And so even in that perspective, we are prone to ideas that would suggest that if there's problems in your life, if you're dealing with issues of struggle, then God's trying to get your attention. He's trying to teach you a lesson, right? So why are you having this trouble? Well, I haven't learned enough patience, and God's teaching me patience. So as soon as I let go of that idea, and then recognize when I love my life, it's an uncontrolling way. When I love my children, it's an uncontrolling way. When I love my church, it's an uncontrolling way. I thought that has to be the way God is. And it changed everything. But at the end of the day, I find that doesn't sit comfortably with most people's developed framework of who God is. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind speaking to that.
I find that too. You know, the people who like my book the most usually come into three categories. One, there's a big category of people. In fact, they send me letters frequently saying who are victims, who are survivors of abuse, torture, trauma. And for them, this idea that God didn't cause or even allow the bad things that happen to them, that is just such good news. Because if that's not the case, God either is punishing them or abandoned them, or, you know, is manipulating to try to teach some weird lesson by letting a woman be raped. I mean, it just gets really weird once you go down that.
Yeah.
But then there's a second group. I call them the theology nerds. They sort of wrestle with the hard questions of theology, and they stumble upon these ideas. And for them, it's really exciting because this idea not only solves this big question of suffering, but has lots of other implications. In fact, just this week, I have another book coming out called Questions and Answers for God Can't, in which I apply these ideas to things like prayer, miracles, hope for the end, etc. And then there's the third kind of group, and this is kind of more ambiguous, but I call them the people who are disenfranchised or out of the status quo. And they see the structures that are set up in institutions or governments or businesses, and they're outside of the realms of influence and power, and they're treated unjustly because of that. And they think, okay, now if God is the kind of God who has the power to fix these systemic problems, these evils, and God's not doing it, then, well, I guess maybe God wants all these crazy systems we have that treat me unjustly. And that just doesn't sound like a God of love. So I find that what happens is that people begin to think through the implications of a God who can't control and always loves. And one of the big ones, and your story about talking about your wife and your own story, life history brings this to mind. One of the big ones is that people begin to understand that divine love in general, but God's love included, involves God really being affected by us, really being influenced, really suffering with us. God truly does listen to us. And that's not the view of God you find in Augustine, Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas, the major theologians in history. And when we apply that in our own lives, in our marriages, our partnerships, whatever, all of a sudden we see there's value in listening to those who we care for. It's not easy sometimes, believe me. So if you're a parent and you've had kids who make foolish choices, which is about every parent on the planet, it hurts to suffer with your kid. But that's a part of what love involves. If you willingly suffer with them, yes, you're trying to influence them toward what's good and right. You're not passively just doing nothing, but you're also not manipulating and controlling, like you mentioned earlier.
So that, actually, when you think about it from a Christian perspective, that is what we see in Jesus Christ, right?
I sure think so.
We believe this is God stepping into human history. So he genuinely does suffer with us, which is what we call kenosis. But you took that one step further forward, and I try to avoid using technical terms, but kenosis just means Jesus left, or Christ left eternity and stepped in, emptied himself of his godness and walked with us as one of us. But there is, even within that idea, the sense that maybe God could shift from that space to a space where he is fixing stuff, right?
Sorry,
go ahead.
It's pretty common amongst contemporary theologians who call themselves kenosis or kenotic theologians to say that God is voluntarily self-limited, that God is self-emptying in some way. I call it self-giving and others empowering. But in their view, God voluntarily does this, at least most of the time. God could occasionally become unself-limited and intervene and fix something single-handedly. And maybe God does that at special times for miracles or whatever. Or, there's various theologians have different views. But the problem with thinking that God is voluntarily self-limited is then you have to look every torture victim in the eye and say, God could have become unself-limited, helped you out, rescued you single-handedly, but for whatever mysterious reason, or God really wanted to teach you a lesson or whatever, God's punishing you. God didn't do that. So I make the claim, and that's the essential kenosis label that you mentioned earlier, that this self-giving, others empowering love isn't something that God voluntarily chooses to do, but it's God's very nature to be like this. And so that means God simply can't intervene to single-handedly rescue. But it does mean God is active, calling, persuading, luring, wooing, to use John Wesley's language, creation toward what is good in every single moment.
So even in the struggle, for example, the recent Black Lives Matter movement, and you see this rising response that's broad-based and not limited to just one racial perspective, but a broad-based movement that's saying, when we say Black Lives Matter, we are in fact saying that everybody matters, because up to the date we've acted like they don't matter, and we want this very inclusive thing. So then you've got this response that says, well, everybody matters, but that's almost ignoring the struggle, right? So all lives matter becomes the response, and it's ignoring, and I don't want to get off of the political equation, but however, well, Black Lives Matter. I 100% am in that space because that's actually saying the right thing. But what I am trying to say here, in terms of essential kenosis, it's not about God fixing political structures or people's opinion, but God wooing humanity to a space that is inclusive and embracing, where all people stand together on an equal playing field. With as poorly as I said that, would that be in some way representing what you're saying?
Yes, that's very well said. Another way I sometimes like to say it is that, love has an element of justice in it.
Mm,
And when I use this word justice, I'm not talking about, God getting retribution, God kicking your butt, God angry and sending pain and suffering, because you've done something wrong. I'm not talking about that kind of punitive justice. I'm
right,
talking about restorative
right.
or some sort of justice that involves the good of the whole.
Mm,
And I think that's what at the heart of Black Lives Matter is about.
right,
That
right,
love
right.
means that you look for the good of everyone, but especially the oppressed, those
Exactly.
who are pushed to the
That's
margins, those who are victimized. And so, yes, that it applies to important social issues like
yes.
Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, that's right. And it's this old idea: if I value free speech, I've got to give you free speech in order to have free speech myself. So when you use the word oppressed, that's the word I really want to try to get at. To see an oppressed people and to liberate them from that oppression is an expression of love that actually is self-loving in that same space, right? That's actually as loving for me as it is for the people that are oppressed when I bring them to the place of release and freedom.
Yeah, sometimes that's hard to feel. If
Mm,
you're the person kind of who's on top of the heap, who's getting the advantages of the system, like, I'm a white male in the United
mm,
States. I've had lots of advantages.
right.
Um,
Don't even recognize
when
them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Often I don't know what they are, but I
yeah.
could I could point out some that I'm conscious of as well.
Right, right.
And sometimes when there's an upheaval and there's a push toward justice, those of us who have some degree of power are reticent to give it up because it feels like it's not being fair. Like, I didn't do anything bad to get to this position. It was
Right.
just kind of handed to me. And it feels awkward. And it's often only as you begin to think through it and work with people who need this justice, who need this elevation of status, that you begin to see it really is for your own good.
Right.
That there's some negative things that are happening as a part of your world that you didn't see how it was linked to this injustice in the systems around you.
Right.
But it's harder for some people to see at first glance.
That's right, and I really appreciate you saying that. The issues very much there are identity issues. It's what I've invested my understanding of who I am in. I think I made the comment in a video a couple of weeks back that the extent to which I refuse positive change is the extent to which I've invested my own identity in the way things are now. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
people don't even recognize that this is not about objective good. This is about how I know myself, which is why I resist things. Anyway, all of that to say, this comes down to this word essential, because I think people in vernacular or common usage tend to use the word essential to mean very, very important. But if it doesn't happen, there might be other options. We can find another way, right? Which is absolutely not what the word literally essential means. Essential is responding to the word essence, which is the heart core. So when you say essential kenosis, or this is essentially who God is, you don't giving an expression to say this is one way of looking at God. You're saying there isn't any other way of looking at God, at least to be consistent within these constructs, right?
That's right. Yeah. Another way to look at it is ask the question, to what degree does God have freedom to do things? Now,
Mm,
there have been some Christians who've wanted to say God's free to do anything God wants to do. God can say, this existing all the time really sucks. I'm going to stop existing tomorrow.
mm.
I mean, very few people actually think that, but some people think that God's freedom is such that God could freely choose to stop existing.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm making the claim here that God's love, which is self-giving and others empowering,
mm,
is God's very nature. It's God's essence, to use the word
mm,
here.
mm,
And that means God must necessarily love us and all
mm,
creation.
mm,
Now, I think God has freedom in choosing how to create moment by moment. But the idea that God's going to love every single person is, and every single creature, in fact, in my view, is something that is necessary or essential to who God is. And
mm.
it's who, to put it philosophically, it's who God is by definition.
Right.
And that's an important claim, I think, if we're going to take the themes of love and make them first in God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome, Tom. That's so great. I'd love to go down the rabbit hole of creation at this point and look at how God is present in every piece of it, but I guess we don't have time to look at that. So let me put a couple of ideas here together and see how you might be able to respond to them. There's a theological word that talks about this idea of evil. It's theodicy, and I think that's an important part of this process. But at the end of the day, it's trying to explain how there is evil, right? In the essential kenosis, God can't perspective. How do you avoid the idea that this is simply us trying to rescue God from being blamed for bad stuff? And at the end of the day, when we have arrived at that space, we've moved away from this omnipotence idea, but how have we not moved to a place of impotence?
Yeah, great question. I really do. So theodicy is the activity to try to justify or explain why someone believes in God despite the kind of world we live in that has these evils in it that I call genuine evils. And my proposal is to say that God simply can't control others, can't
Mm,
single-handedly stop things from happening in the world, not only amongst free will creatures, but against smaller entities and even the micro units of reality. It does sound to some people when they first hear this, like I have just described the wimp of the universe,
right,
an
right,
impotent God,
right.
this little weakling who's on the sidelines, sort of with pom-poms cheering us on, but not really doing anything, not having any power. Um, that's not the God I think exists. In
Mm,
fact, I even used the word almighty to talk about this God's power. I think God is almighty in three senses. God is the source of might for everything that occurs in the universe.
mm,
God is mightier than anyone or anything in the universe. God has no rivals, to quote the psalmist. And God provides the power to every single one of us. God exerts might, God provides might, and God is the mightiest. I think God can have that kind of power and yet be unable to control anyone or anything.
mm,
So this isn't an impotent God. This isn't a God sitting on the sidelines or cheering, from the sidelines. This is a God in the game,
mm.
active, always influential at all levels to the utmost, but never in a controlling way. And when I
Right,
mean the word control, I mean being the only actor bringing about some kind of result.
right. That's fantastic, Tom. I love that. I just as an aside, just to uh, recognize a space in my own life. Happened to sit under the teaching of one Dr. Chester Mulder back in the 80s, who's now passed from this life. A wonderful, beautiful person. Uh, I didn't realize how much he had liberated me by the comment that I'm going to make until years later when I was looking back on it. But I remember him saying, "Don't worry about thinking about the omni categories. Recognize that God is everything that God needs to be in any given context in order to be God." And that's so liberated me then to be able to explore the concept of who God might be. And then in that space, when you come to the conclusion that God is love, all of those things feed into a representation of his love. I think probably the one that's easiest to put, well, at least clear, is the issue of sovereignty. Many people use the idea of God's sovereignty as the ultimate expression of who God is, that God is in control, he's in charge. It seems to me that if you're going to have love as the center, then some way sovereignty has to slip in under that and reinforce that. Are you able to speak to that idea at all?
Yeah, when I say it philosophically, I say this: love is logically prior to all the other attributes in God's nature.
Mm,
When I say it more in the sort of a laity kind of, I say we should take love and make it conceptually first in God, and then try to understand the other beliefs we have about God in light of love.
right.
So that means, as you pointed out, that when we talk about God's power, if we have claims that about God's power that are going to clash or come in contradiction with love, then I think power has to be rethought. Again, I don't think we should throw out power entirely, but we should rethink it in light of love. We could say this about other attributes. There's some in our tradition, the holiness tradition, who understand God's holiness in a way that God can't be in the presence of anything that's sinful. I don't think it's a faithful rendering of our tradition, but that's the way they understand holiness, as purity, and God, has to turn God's back on any sin unless Jesus somehow comes and rescues and stands between whatever. I think that way of thinking about holiness contradicts love. And so
Yep.
we need to rethink holiness in light of this understanding of love, which, as you rightly pointed out, I think it involves intentional action in relational response with others to promote overall well-being, to promote the good, the blessed life, the abundant life. So we should understand God in light of God's love. It doesn't mean that love is the only attribute, but it does, in my view, mean we should understand all the other attributes in light of love.
Right. That's amazingly wonderful. Thanks, Tom. That's brilliant. Let me begin to draw this to a close with moving from the theoretical constructs. The best part of this idea of God for me is that it resists staying at the theoretical, right? It moves into the practical. And what in the church, Christians probably of all religious faiths desire to see others believe what they believe at the heart level. We frame our sense of the eternities in certain faith constructs. Whether that's right or not remains to be seen. But we do tend to do that, right? We see our mission as bringing other people to see the world from our perspective. I want us to then move into this space of the mission of the church, how we conceive of what it is. Having people hold a faith construct in this space, I think actually is important, but it's it has to be consistent. The way we go about that has to be consistent with these ideas. So can you help me make that transition from an idea to a practice?
Yeah. So in terms of missional thinking, I think missional work involves believing God is already present and active in all situations, in all people, not necessarily meaning that all people are understanding God or all situations rightly reflect God's love, but God's already there, present and active. And it means that we need to listen and be affected by those with whom we engage. The idea that the missionaries came into the context with all the answers and the people were in darkness with absolutely no truth at all, that doesn't fit in this kind of a concept. So we engage in a missional kind of way, first and foremost in terms of love, and love involves being affected by others. It means listening to others. It means seeing truth and value in other traditions. I'll say, I'm known to say a few controversial things. Let me say one right now. I'm not a Christian just because I think it's the grooviest religion. I'm a follower of Jesus because he's the one who captures my imagination with the themes of love. I find love in other religious
mm,
traditions. I don't
mm,
think Christianity is the only one that talks about well-being. Now,
mm,
I happen to think it talks about it best.
mm,
That's from my particular perspective. So that's why I'm a part of the Christian tradition and try to
mm.
follow Jesus. But I begin to see connection with other faith traditions around the issues of love. And I'm quite willing to point those out and celebrate what we can share in common in terms of love. And this not only includes other religious traditions, this includes non-religions, paganism or
Right,
sort of general culture.
right.
But being open to and acknowledging the truth and love in others doesn't mean that all religions are equal, that I have
Mm,
to think, Jesus is the same as Hitler or
mm,
whatever.
mm.
I can have particular aspects of Christianity or faith that just entice me and inspire me. And then because of that, privilege Christianity, while at the same time as appreciating the truth and the love I see in other places.
Right, exactly. I love that. I really love it. Um, I have journeyed a little bit alongside some of the atheistic thoughts over the last few years, and one of the struggles that I see happening from that perspective is um, the articulation that, so from a Christian perspective, we might say the atheist is the atheist because they're filled with hatred and
Yeah,
anger
not
and
usually.
rejection. But it's not true, is it? And so,
Not most of the time.
no,
Yeah.
that's right, exactly. And so, one of the privileges of opening the mind up is to recognize actually God in that space, that
Yeah.
walking with, drawing people to ideas that represent who He is. And here's the thing that goes along with the uncontrolling God that I think is really, really important. If I say to you now, Tom, you're wrong, and then you start trying to tell me why you're right, but I keep on resisting that, we're going to move apart, right?
Yeah.
It's just you can't keep that dialogue. But if I say, I'm not sure I get that, but I think I understand where you're coming from, help me to understand that. And then I start to value pieces of what you're saying, we move closer. And
Yeah.
while I become more available to your perspective, you also become more available to my perspective. And that maybe it's true. In fact, I'm convinced it is, but let's use the
Yeah.
word maybe. Maybe that's the evangelistic device, that as we engage people, love people, embrace people, and journey with people, they come to a space, I think C.S. Lewis said his imagination was baptized. So he started thinking in Christian constructs because of that journey of love and grace.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I like that a lot. Is it all right if I jump back to something that you said earlier before we close here? Because I wanted
Sure.
to make another point.
Mm-hmm.
Because you shared a little bit about your own journey. And one of the things you talked about, or a word that I heard you say, or is the idea of being significant or valuable or
Mm,
worthwhile.
mm,
And I want to point to another, I think, asset or advantage the uncontrolling love of God or the God can't view has. And this is the idea that God actually needs you and me for love to win.
right.
You see, a lot of theologies have said that God invites us into the work of what God is doing in the world, but is sort of in the back of their theological structure. They have a God who can control and
Mm-hmm.
who can fix things single-handedly. And even though God is inviting us, according to this view, God could just get the job done, even
Mm,
if we don't cooperate.
mm,
But in my perspective, this uncontrolling love perspective, God's love seeks, calls, invites us to cooperate. And if we don't, then love can't win to the
right.
fullest degree.
Right.
Now, for some people, that is very alarming
Mm,
because what matters to them most is that God wins at the end, even if
mm,
it has to be through absolute force, power, fiat, sovereign control.
right.
But if that's the case, then what you and I do really doesn't matter.
Right. Right.
In my view, what you and I do really matters. You and
Right.
I are significant, worthwhile partners with the God of the universe.
Mm,
And to me, that just jacks me up. It gets
yeah.
me so excited because that means that this interview we're doing right now isn't just some sort of piddly old thing that just, we threw it out there, but God doesn't really care ultimately. No, this can actually be part of God's work in the world. God actually needs for us to act in these kinds of ways in order for what Christians call the kingdom of God or God's reign to actually come to its fullness. And that excites me.
Wow. Yeah, that excites me too. I live in a space now where I am convinced that the extent to which we embrace and move in this direction is the extent to which the church becomes relevant to the world in which we live. The extent to which we hold on to structures that are manipulative, controlling, marginalizing is the extent to which we'll continue down the track of irrelevance. And I take your warning, Tom. I think it's right that maybe ultimately the church does become so marginalized because it wants to hold on to structures that ultimately just don't work, that it ceases to have relevance at all. So that is a warning. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I grew up in churches where we use that word revival a lot. And that word usually meant that you went to the altar and sort of regave your heart to Jesus, and you were kind of on a spiritual high and you were going to go out and fly straight. But I wonder if revival can mean something like the church and those of us who are part of it, letting down these walls and barriers, not trying to be controlling, to use this language again, being open to where the Spirit is moving, even if it's moving outside our walls.
Right. No, I love that, Tom. I love that. Well, Tom, one of my great regrets in life, and actually is every time I think about it, it's a regret, is that we have not had long periods of time to sit and chat together. We had a couple where it's been half an hour here or there, but I would have loved to have walked in life with you over a significant period of time. I love the way that it seems to me our hearts beat together. And
I feel the same way about you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it enormously. I think this has tremendous value for us, and it'll help us continue to walk in the garden. So
Excellent.
thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed our conversation.